Hi, Wendy. Thank you so much for joining us today on the SALTovation podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So let's start with the $80 billion that the IRS received when President Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. One of those items that the IRS earmarked money for was to improve the taxpayer experience. What issues would you say are at the forefront for the IRS to fix? And then, what does improving that taxpayer experience mean for those taxpayers?
Well, I would say, improving the taxpayer experience at this point, it really is a dire issue, right? In 2020, the Taxpayer Advocate Report to Congress indicated that the third most serious problem that the IRS faced is that they are significantly underfunded to service taxpayers and collect tax. And that report cited that they're unable to answer millions of taxpayer phone calls. They're unable to process timely correspondence, and that the tax gap and our federal deficit continues to grow as a result of that underfunding, right? So I think that for those of us that work with the IRS every day, make withholding tax payments, to file monthly or quarterly or annual returns, to work through penalty notices, it's awful. Working with the IRS is terrible. We dread the thought of having to call them. We wait for hours on hold, only to be hung up on inadvertently, or not have our issue resolved. So I think automating and improving taxpayer services is it's a dire issue for the IRS to fix.
Yeah, and it's certainly not a slight against the people who are working there and working really hard and certainly have to be overworked. Every IRS agent that I've spoken with is generally, very pleasant and wants to help out. And they're just kind of so hamstrung by, the resources or lack thereof that they have. And, so any IRS agents that are listening, we do appreciate you.
We do.
We're not mad at you.
Thank you for saying that, because you're right. They do not get enough credit. And you're right. Can you imagine if you worked for a company that you went to every day where you were so underfunded that you had to pick and choose which customers to help? So the fact that they show up and go to work every day sometimes is amazing to me.
Well, and
they are a not-for-profit, really.
Yeah.
They're not a business. They only do so much and they can only pay for so much. And we don't exactly have a culture in America where we're super pro, let's give everybody our tax dollars, right?
That's right.
We have a kind of an anti-tax culture in America.
Well, yeah, and that's the hard thing is
interesting to me.
The IRS is often a lot of automated generated notices, which kind of goes back to, you can write a response, but these notices are going to keep coming because it just sits in a bin somewhere.
That's right.
And, oftentimes the people who call the IRS are so clueless. So, the agents are doing their best to help the people who are just I got this and this notice, it's really scary. I don't know what to do about it. We see the same in states as well, but it's a really scary experience to get a piece of to get a piece of mail from the IRS, in any capacity.
I spoke to a colleague of mine today who talked with me about not just that notice piece, but the delay with service in terms of being a large company. So if you're a large business with the IRS, you're assigned what's called a large corporate representative to help you with some of the tax issues that you deal with on a regular basis. And she is on the phone daily trying to talk to different parts of the IRS about issues she deals with. And she was telling me today that large corporate representative, that there's so many things in their queue that she won't hear from that person and get a response on things before those notices start to generate.
Yeah.
So it's common for her to call and say, hey, I need you to move payments, or I need you to, make an adjustment on the account. And it's before they can ever get to it, they've already issued, penalty notices, and we're going to seize your assets and all that kind of stuff. So it is, it's frustrating.
Yeah. So then what would, other than kind of just, it needs money, right? What would be some other kind of things that would kind of improve that experience?
Yeah.
Or I guess is that, obviously the money allows for, procurement of assets, whether it's humans or technology, what would you say, some of those that improvements or
Yeah.
where could that money be spent wisely in your
There's like
purview?
some really specific things within the bill that require the IRS to invest in things like callback technology, or other technologies like that to provide like a more personalized taxpayer experience or customer service type of experience that I think some of us, we're accustomed to. And there's also funding to, look for investments in phone systems, in some of their IT systems, just internally to administer tax. I mean, if you can just think about kind of the back office of any business, if they're using antiquated laptops, antiquated Word and Microsoft type programs, or antiquated equipment in general, right? It makes processing much more difficult. We were excited when the IRS stopped some of the processes from paper and gave us a fax number to send to. But look, how many people have faxes these days,
Yeah.
So we need them to go to that next step, which is let us, maybe email you or send some things
Right.
to you online, right?
Yeah.
So I think those are things we're looking for sure.
Yeah. It's funny when you talk to people who aren't tax people and they're like, someone talked to me about like a fax machine. I don't even know what a fax machine, like who the hell uses faxes anymore? I was like, well, I do, my coworkers do, because I faxed 2 forms this morning, both like one to the city and county of Denver and one to the state of Oregon.
Yep.
Faxes are still a thing. Now it's processed through our email and it's probably, transmitted via email, but like fax numbers still exist.
They do. That paper still exists too, and not just with IRS, but with the states too. And they get people who don't work in this industry when you tell, what do you mean I have to mail that private tax information to them? I can't, there's nowhere to securely send it. I mean, that's all of the places that I think, at least for the federal side of it, that we're hoping, that the IRA funding goes toward.
Well, and we understand that the
Yeah,
IRS
it's just funny when you think about money and people. Well, they're hiring these people, right? But then how many people want to do a job that feels like everybody's mad at you, right? How do you encourage a culture that takes care of these people who are trying to take care of the people? So we have to make it like less adversarial, but then also generate those people to come in. I mean, it's just such a push-pull with business regulation, oversight, and all that to really get people on board that
It
want
really
to,
is.
care for the public fisc.
Well, yeah,
I think
yeah, it's fascinating.
It's circular, right? The IRS collects our tax money, which funds everything else that we rely upon. So it's like you can get mad at the IRS, but you can't get mad at the IRS when you want money for things, right?
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, take it for granted every time I go to what?
99% of the revenues that our federal government operates on get collected by the IRS. So you would think that we would be more concerned with ensuring they had the funds and the people, right, to make sure those systems can do that efficiently. So, yeah.
So we understand that the IRS is focused kind of on 3 items this year: digital asset reporting, which we're not going to spend a ton of time on, modernization, and tax literacy. Kind of going one by one, what's the IRS's goal, in digital asset reporting, and what will that impact be on business?
Yeah. So as part of the infrastructure bill, so that's how long now, right? It's been a little bit since we saw that. As part of that bill, the tax law was amended to require 1099 reporting of digital asset transactions. So whether it was an exchange or a bank or PayPal or whoever, anyone that was a third party that was transacting for U.S. taxpayers in digital assets, they were going to have to report the 1099. The IRS uses 1099 reporting. It's their primary compliance tool. And so this was an area that it had grown to be about a $3 trillion market before kind of the big bottom fell out this year, but had grown to be about a $3 trillion market. And earlier in the year, Barclays had put out a report estimating a $50 billion tax gap. So they definitely had some, kind of statistics they could report to in that area, that we need information reporting so we can curtail, the tax evasion that's going on in that area. So I anticipate that, we're absolutely going to see regulations. We have yet to see the Treasury and IRS actually give us prescriptive regulations so that we can issue whatever 1099 it's going to be. We've had some conversation. We know it's going to be a new 1099 form, for example. But, the Treasury and IRS haven't released those regs yet. So personally, I think it's because they do need to get their own systems in order, and they do need to get their own processes updated, because this is very much like the stock market in that you report billions of transactions. So they're set to receive millions, if not billions, of more information returns. Are they really ready for that? Are their systems ready after what we just talked about? So I think part of the delay is for them to take some of that funding, hopefully, and expand the information return systems to be able to address that expansion for digital asset reporting.
Because we're seeing that with the Wayfair, the Wayfair law coming into place in 2018. Now you've got everybody registering for sales tax. The states don't have the bandwidth to take that in. I remember when Colorado, where I live, asked for 10 full-time equivalents to help process new licenses. The government wouldn't give this, the register wouldn't give it to them.
Wow.
They couldn't get the funding. So they don't have the humans. I mean, you're thinking this at the IRS, it's the same thing across our nation. Just, we got to have humans. Technology doesn't solve all of it. Yeah. Interesting.
It's interesting. Colorado is one of those states that's just recently going through a modernization change as well. And I wonder if some of that is triggered by what you just talked about, like that growth, and then coupled with the antiquated systems, right? So,
yeah. Yeah.
Well, and that's kind of a good transition to kind of the second kind of IRS focus point, is that modernization. I would say modernization is kind of an all-encompassing word. It can be kind of genericized. In the context of the IRS, what is it talking about?
Yeah. So this actually started in 2019 with the Taxpayer First Act. So the IRS was given some initial funding to start making changes to their internal systems. Most of it was related to the kind of information security aspects of the technology that the IRS uses. So last year, we started to see the first outputs from that funding. For personal taxpayers, the IRS built the online taxpayer portal. So you and we can go in and check our balances as individual taxpayers. We can see our tax returns, our W-2s, our 1099s, our 1040s, and how the IRS is, applying all of that information. You can interact with the IRS via chat. So there's some, transparency that they've created there that we never had before as taxpayers. We also saw them release the ID.me system. And this is a credentialing system that non-IRS employees or users of their systems have to establish an account in first in order to get access to use those other systems. And so we saw them roll out that process and begin to move some of their systems behind it, so that in order to use them, you had to go through a new credentialing process. And then this month, actually, it's a little bit delayed. We are expecting the IRS to release the brand new 1099 filing system. And this is designed for small businesses to be able to create and submit their own 1099 forms, something they can't do with their IRS's legacy fire system today. And so, I think this goes back to what I said before. I think as the IRS prepares for digital asset reporting and also just improving this 30-year-old 1099 reporting system that they have, they use some of that funding to build the first iteration of this portal. And then hopefully with more funding from the IRA, we're hoping they'll be able to do a phase 2 and a phase 3 for that system, to be able to completely replace what Sovos and other large software filers are using today to submit, hundreds of millions of information returns.
Yeah, I can only imagine the lift of that. I laughed when you said ID.me, because I I've had two different kind of things where I've had people really hesitant about setting up ID Me because it's kind of a third party, and it's like, I don't want like my face or my whatever kind of out there. And it's like, well, it's already out there. So you got a
Yeah.
driver's license. But anyway, I was trying to not take that like automatic child tax credit payment. So I tried to set it up, log in to defer my piece. And I tried to get my husband to get it set up. But because during the pandemic, he grew out his hair and has this long bushy beard, ID Me couldn't connect the two of like his pre-pandemic look versus his mid-pandemic look. And so like every time I hear ID Me, I think of me like yelling at my phone and like my husband, like, take your glasses off, put them back on, pull your hair back, like go shave, like just trying to
get through
our like child credit.
Right.
It was so every time I hear that, it kind of it makes me giggle. But I mean, that's a big lift. And also
It's
like
huge.
You also have to kind of educate the people as to what that is. Because realistically, even as a taxpayer, and I'm going to be vulnerable for a moment, I don't have an IRS account. I didn't know that I could go in and see kind of my history and what that is. So, there's an education component too, to know, hey, here are the resources. Here's what's available to you. Here's the benefit to you. And I think there's also a lot of skepticism with some people about phishing. Like even, as a tax practitioner, I get something from the IRS. They're about like renew my PTIN. I was
That's
like, well,
right.
is this real? Is this phishing? Like, just that educational component for, do you know if any of the money is being spent on kind of taxpayer education and, awareness efforts?
Yeah, actually, so a couple things there. As part of IRA, about almost 4 billion of the funding was set aside specifically for pre-filing services, education, taxpayer advocacy. These are all areas within the IRS, which include like things on the website, publications, outward outreach to certain segments of taxpayers that they are having compliance issues with. The area they didn't have funding for, right? They couldn't, for example, you hear a lot these days about the gig economy platform companies, right? And the 1099K filers and that big threshold thing. Well, I think being able to actually have some funding to communicate to those taxpayers in advance, give them some education in advance of receiving 1099s they've never received before, so they know what to do with them. The IRS doesn't have funding to do any of that education outreach without on their normal, appropriations that they're given from Congress. So this funding is super important, I think, for the IRS to be able to really bring things out of these paper publications that are really hard to find and are buried and get them out onto the, leverage the internet, leverage searches so that taxpayers can really, advantage some education before filing. And then, like you said, something goes wrong and now they're calling or writing more letters and it just becomes this doom loop of, no response.
Yeah, it's funny when just in the IRS, yeah, it's so interconnected, and it does just have like this trickle down of everything. And then kind of there's efforts at, the IRS, and I think we've also seen it at the state level. We've got some states updating their systems, integrating new portals. I just set up, transitioned a couple clients from eTides in Pennsylvania to the new system in Pennsylvania. Saw some stuff with Oregon. Are there any examples that you have that, the federal tax legislation and policy is trickling down into the states?
Yeah, a couple of different areas. It's what's interesting, those that you just mentioned, because they are like one of, I think, 8 states this year that migrated to new tax systems. And I know that some of that definitely, is related to kind of what we were talking about before, just growth in tax policy and, wanting to or needing to, have updated systems to address that. But following, I would say, in terms of policy coming down, following the IRS lead, we did see Ohio, Colorado, District of Columbia, Maryland, and some others, we've seen them basically eliminate paper processing, which for withholding taxes or for 1099 or W-2 information. So just completely eliminating paper processing of those things, or we see them drastically reducing the electronic filing threshold requirement so that they can really get at paper processing. And, even the IRS, obviously they're trying to eliminate paper. It's, their kryptonite according to the Taxpayer Advocate. But, even the IRS recognizes that there's a subset of the population that's never going to get off paper. And you do need to, offer that. But from a state perspective, I was really amazed at how many states are just like, no more. Everything is electronic, no more. So we're seeing a lot of that. The other thing I would say is that we see the states often follow the IRS in terms of the actual statutory reporting requirements. So when the IRS introduced the new 1099 NEC form, which was for reporting non-employee compensation a couple years ago, the states soon followed with mandates for businesses to report that 1099 also, right? So we often see the IRS come out with a new 1099 requirement like that and have a state follow. But we've seen it go the other way too. It's not uncommon for us to see the states, several states, making their own information reporting requirements around something, and then eventually the IRS kind of getting on board with it. And that 1099K threshold that I mentioned before is a great example of that. So kind of see it both ways.
I just remember years ago when I started in different areas, and I remember doing a bunch of sales tax returns by hand as I got outsourced as a young staff person to do them. And then all the states were starting to pivot to ACH or e-filing. I'm like, oh my God, I was going to the copy machine and making copies of the checks and the forms and then going to the post office and state stamping. It was ridiculously manual. But then the problem, of course, was with states versus federal was everything wasn't the same. So It's like, I wish we had more parity. At least the IRS is the IRS, but even within the IRS, you don't always have parity amongst different types of reporting. And that is very challenging because
it's a really great point.
Legal entities have different issues and different reporting. Yeah.
And it spans not just sales and use, I swear it doesn't matter what area of tax I talk to somebody about. It seems like that issue plagues all parts of tax working with either the IRS or the states.
It's fascinating to me. And you think also why do you need to change the system? Because you didn't set it up right to begin with, or you didn't anticipate the next thing. Is that the tough part of it as government, or was it not funded enough? I mean, we work with software companies, and what I've heard over the years is this minimum viable product before you launch. Yep. So you launch it, and then you're like, okay, it's going to work. It's going to create momentum. People are going to buy it. Now let's improve it. But when you're a government, can you do that? Can it be iterative? So I think that's always really challenging. I mean, even with that healthcare thing, what was that? That just
Affordable Care Act.
Obama was president, right? Yep. What a disaster, because the rollout was such a mess. People got shut out, and there was an explanation for it, but it's and the Ticketmaster debacle recently.
I was going to say it's like trying to get Taylor Swift tickets,
right?
Right.
I think that's kind of good stuff, because I think you get this this technology is going to work, app, great. But it has to catch up. So we need to give it a little grace, quite honestly. But I think it's really hard I find it very hard to anticipate the needs of all the ways that business moves forward in order to adjust the reporting and put it in the right buckets. How the heck is government supposed to figure it out? Taxpayers can't. So
it goes back to what you said though about that happy, because there is no happy medium there. It's like government's forcing business into sending it into their formats and their requirements. Yeah. But on the flip side, business needs to, conform to GAAP rules and other regulations, right? And legal requirements. And so it is very difficult, particularly when there's such disparity across so many agencies.
Yeah. Well, and there's not an ability to enforce. I mean, I came to the conclusion a few years ago after I left the Big Four went to a regional firm that the largest taxpayers in this world bear the largest burden of tax compliance, and small startup businesses are not complying for good reasons. They can't. They don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the tools. But here they are taking a chomp out of the native businesses. Amazon being a perfect example, taking away from all the bricks and mortar, Best Buy, whatever, but they're not fully compliant. So they're taking tax dollars away from governments to change the character of how you and I do business. And all those legacy companies are gone. Sears, There, you know, we don't want to go in and look at all what you picked. We want to look at everything that's out there.
That's right.
So that is, there's a yin and yang to that.
There is, and it's a great example of a company that, you know, it's like, at what point do they have that social responsibility? You know, that Wayfair thing didn't need to happen, right? For Wayfair to sort of maybe do the socially right thing there, right? And I say the same thing about.
Oh no,
you know,
they brought, yeah.
So.
Well, so I'm in the American Bar. I'm a lawyer and a CPA. So there's this thing called American Bar Association, IPT, Institute of Professionals in Tax. They're the people that do direct tax. They're state and local people. And then they merged with the American Bar, and they've been having this co-conference for, I don't know, 20 something years. So I went to it before the Wayfair case, and the lawyer representing Newegg, which was one of the three plaintiffs or defendants, whatever, I guess they were defendants, bringing their brief before the Supreme Court. And he's talking about this concept called stare decisis, which is let things be as they were, leave the case as it is. And I'm listening to him thinking that ain't going to happen, because too much money is not going into the coffers of these governments, and they are dependent on it. So we need somebody to act. And so when the Wayfair decision came out, I'm like, I'm seeing it being perfectly relevant. But if you think Wayfair, Newegg, or Overstock wanted to bring a case against South Dakota, you got another thing coming. That is a state of less than 1 million humans. They could have applied their easy peasy lemon squeezy. So they spent the money to get parity for all the benefit of all of us. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, it's a great
point. To be honest, I mean, they had the wherewithal and the financial acumen and the legal team to take those cases forward. And then, you know, we've seen this giant rollout, but, you know, it's hard even with the federal government when you bring a case, if it affects you, it doesn't affect them, right? Because every business is unique. That's why they're
oftentimes when you're trying to help one business, you might be hurting another industry. So that's the other issue is like, well, how do you, you know, and that's where I think government struggles too.